Hi everyone, I'm Wapnick, and you're watching Ergativity and Friends. Today marks the beginning of Chapter 3, where we'll discuss alignment in relation to a number of syntactic phenomena. In the first section of Chapter 3, which you're watching right now, we'll focus on alignment and word order. First, we'll take a look at two languages with accusative word order. Then, we'll examine a language that exhibits ergative alignment with respect to word order. Finally, we'll spend some time talking about whether or not it's possible for a language to exhibit neutral alignment in its word order. So, without further ado, let's begin. Every English clause can be broken down into a number of clausal positions. However, for our purposes, we need only consider 4 of these positions. I'm just going to say that again to be as clear as possible. In English, there are far more than just 4 clausal positions, but for the observations we're about to make, sticking to the smallest will be sufficient. Position 3 is occupied by the verb. Position 2 can be occupied by auxiliaries, but, as indicated by the parentheses around aux, it can also be left empty. Let us now discuss position 1. One of the things that can occupy position 1 is s-arguments. The fact that s-arguments occupy position 1 is illustrated by the following data. John can swim, and they are singing. In 1a, we see the s-argument John appear in front of the auxiliary can, which sits in position 2. Likewise, in b, we see the s-argument they precede the position 2 auxiliary are. We can also take a look at example 2. Mary returned from the market. Even though this clause doesn't contain an auxiliary, note that it is still consistent with the idea that s-arguments occupy position 1. However, s-arguments aren't the only things that can occupy position 1. A-arguments also take this position. Consider the following data. Alice will study math, and I should eat more vegetables. In 3a, the A-argument Alice precedes the position 2 auxiliary will. Moreover, in b, the A-argument I appears in front of should. Again, note that our ideas about English word order are valid even in clauses without auxiliaries. Now that we've talked about positions 1 through 3, we can discuss position 4. In English, position 4 is occupied by O-arguments. If we go back to 3a, we'll see the O-argument math immediately follow the verb study, which occupies position 3. Similarly, in 3b, we see the O-argument more vegetables appear right behind the verb eat. If we take a step back and look at all the observations about English word order we've made thus far, we notice something interesting. S and A arguments occupy the same clausal position, that is, position 1, while O arguments occupy a different one, i.e., position number 4. Since in English, S and A arguments behave similarly with respect to word order, while O arguments behave differently, we can say that English word order follows an accusative pattern. For another example of a language with accusative word order, we can take a look at Turkish. However, I know the content we've discussed so far has been pretty dense. So, if you need to take a quick break and have a snack or a drink of water, please feel free to pause the video. Okay, ready? Once more unto the breach. As was the case in English, in Turkish, every clause can be broken down into a number of clausal positions, four of which will be relevant to us. Position 4 is occupied by the verb. Position 2 can be occupied by an expression of time, like today or 3 weeks ago, but this is optional as indicated by the parentheses. Let us now talk a bit about position 1. As in English, in Turkish, one of the things that can occupy position 1 is S arguments. Consider the following clause. The president is now going to Ankara. Here, the S argument, the president, appears in front of the expression of time now, which sits in position 2. Another thing that can occupy position 1 is A arguments. Consider the data in 6. Here, we see the A argument Mehmet precede the expression of time yesterday evening. Let us now talk about position 3. In Turkish, position 3 is occupied by O arguments. If we go back to example 6, we'll see that the O argument, the book, sits between the verb read and the expression of time yesterday evening. Before we move on, note that all of our ideas about Turkish word order are also valid in clauses like these, which lack expressions of time. If we reflect on all the observations we've made about Turkish word order, we'll notice that S and A arguments occupy the same clausal position, while O arguments occupy a different one. Thus, Turkish exhibits accusative alignment with respect to word order. The information I've presented in this section can be summarized as follows. For an example of a language that exhibits ergative alignment with respect to word order, let's take a look at the Nilotic language, Päri. As in English and Turkish, in Päri, every clause can be divided into a number of positions. 3 of these are relevant for the present purposes. Position 2 is occupied by the verb. Moving on to position 1, one of the things that can occupy this preverbal position is S arguments. The idea that S arguments occupy position 1 is illustrated by the following example. Ubur played. Here, the S argument ubur precedes the position 2 verb play. Position 1 is also occupied by O arguments. Consider the clause ubur shot the buffalo. Here, the O argument buffalo sits right in front of the verb shoot. Let us now discuss position 3. In Päri, position 3 is occupied by A arguments. If we go back to example 9, we'll see that the A argument ubur sits behind the position 2 verb. If we look back on all the observations we've made about Päri word order, we'll see that both S and O arguments occupy position 1, whereas A arguments occupy position 3. Thus, unlike in English, where it is S and A arguments that occupy the same clausal position, and O arguments that occupy a different one, here in Päri, S and O arguments occupy the same position, while A arguments occupy a different one. Accordingly, Päri exhibits ergative alignment with respect to word order. So far, we've seen examples of how a language can exhibit accusative and ergative alignment with respect to its word order. So, it seems logical to ask whether or not there are any languages with neutral word order. I'll answer this question in a short moment, but before I do so, please pause the video and think about it a bit for yourself. Okay, ready? Hopefully you concluded that no, there are no languages with neutral word order. No worries if you didn't, though. To help us understand why a language can't have neutral word order, we'll use something called a proof by contradiction. Here's an outline of what we'll do. First, we'll assume it is possible to have a language with neutral word order. Then, using some logical reasoning, we'll show that believing this assumption forces us to accept a statement that is obviously false. Once we've shown that our assumption has led to an absurd result, we can reject it. In other words, we can conclude that it's not possible for a language to have neutral word order. Now that we have an outline of how we'll prove that a language can't have neutral word order, we can proceed with the actual proof. However, as stated earlier, I know the content of this video is pretty dense, so if you need to pause again and take a quick break before continuing, please feel free to do so. Are you back? Great. Let's proceed with our proof of why it's impossible for a language to have neutral word order. First, let's assume that it is possible to have a language with neutral word order. From this assumption, it follows that we can imagine a language with neutral word order. Call this imaginary language X. Since by definition, X exhibits neutral alignment with respect to word order, in X we expect S, A, and O arguments all to behave the same with respect to word order. Since S, A, and O arguments all behave similarly, it must also be the case that A and O arguments behave similarly. Thus, in language X, A and O arguments occupy the same clausal position. From here on, we'll call this position position Y. Like all languages, language X has transitive clauses. Let Z be any transitive clause of language X. According to statement 4, the A argument of Z must occupy position Y. However, statement 4 also tells us that the O argument of Z occupies position Y. Thus, in clause Z, we have two different phrases occupying position Y. But because clause Z has two different phrases occupying a single position, to pronounce Z, we would need to be capable of articulating two different phrases at the same time. But this is absurd. Human biology doesn't allow us to produce two different sets of sounds at the same time. Let us now take a step back. We started with the assumption that it's possible for a language to exhibit neutral alignment with respect to word order. However, using some logical reasoning, we showed that this assumption forces us to accept a statement that is obviously false, namely the statement that it is possible to articulate two different phrases simultaneously. Thus, our assumption must have been wrong, and therefore it is impossible for a language to exhibit neutral word order. Our proof is complete. The information presented in this section can be summarized as follows. So that just about wraps up today's episode. If you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing. Please also feel free to share any thoughts, questions, or suggestions for improvement in the comments. Toodaloo!